Sarah Martinez checked her watch as she pulled out of the grocery store parking lot. It was 3:30 on a Sunday afternoon, and the sun was bright in the clear blue sky. She had just finished her weekly shopping trip, something she did every Sunday without fail. The backseat of her Honda Civic was full of grocery bags, and her military duffel bag sat beside them. She always kept that bag in her car. It held her gym clothes, some emergency supplies, and a few things that reminded her of her time in the Army. The drive home should have taken 15 minutes. Sarah knew the route well. She had driven it hundreds of times since moving to this quiet suburban neighborhood 2 years ago. She worked as a software engineer now, a job that was very different from her previous life as a Green Beret in the United States Army. Most people in her neighborhood had no idea about her military background. She liked it that way. It was peaceful. Sarah stopped at a red light and looked around. The streets were quiet. A few families were walking their dogs. Some kids were riding bicycles on the sidewalk. Everything seemed normal and calm. She thought about the work she had to finish that evening. There was a big project due on Monday, and she wanted to review her code one more time. The light turned green, and Sarah drove forward. She was thinking about her grocery list and wondering if she had forgotten anything when she noticed something in her rearview mirror. Red and blue lights were flashing behind her. A police car was following her. With its emergency lights on, Sarah's heart did not race. Her breathing did not change. This was because of her military training. Years of dangerous situations had taught her to stay calm when unexpected things happened. She looked at her speedometer. She was driving exactly the speed limit. She tried to think of what she might have done wrong. Maybe her registration was expired. Maybe one of her taillights was broken. She put on her turn signal and slowly pulled over to the side of the road. Sarah turned off her engine and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen clearly. This was something she had learned in the Army. Always make sure your hands are visible when dealing with law enforcement. It keeps everyone safe. Sarah looked in her side mirror and watched the police car park behind her. She expected one officer to get out and walk to her window. That was how traffic stops usually worked. But something was different this time. 2 officers got out of the car instead of one. That was unusual for a simple traffic stop. The officers walked toward her car, but they were not walking like people who were planning to give her a ticket for speeding. Their body language was tense. Their shoulders were tight. Their hands were resting on their gun holsters. Sarah noticed these details immediately. Her military training had taught her to read people's body language quickly. These officers thought they might be in danger. The senior officer was tall and had gray hair at his temples. He looked like he was in his 40s. The younger officer was shorter and looked nervous. Both men approached her car from different sides. The older officer came to her driver's side window. The younger officer positioned himself near the back of her car where he could see inside. Sarah rolled down her window and kept her hands on the steering wheel. The older officer looked at her with serious eyes. He did not smile or seem friendly like officers usually did during routine stops. "Ma'am, I need you to keep your hands where I can see them," the officer said. His voice was firm and official. "Do you know why I stopped you today?" Sarah thought for a moment. She really could not think of anything she had done wrong. "No, officer, I don't. Was I speeding?" The officer did not answer her question. Instead, he looked into her back seat. His eyes focused on her military duffel bag. The bag was olive green and had some patches on it from her old unit. It looked exactly like what it was, a military bag. "What's in the bag?" the officer asked. His hand moved closer to his gun. Sarah realized that the officers might think her military bag contained weapons. This was a misunderstanding that could become very dangerous very quickly. She knew she had to be very careful with her words and actions. "It's my gym bag, officer. It has workout clothes and some personal items," Sarah said. She kept her voice calm and steady. "I'm happy to show you what's inside," the younger officer spoke for the first time. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step out of the vehicle. Please, move very slowly and keep your hands visible at all times." Sarah's mind started working quickly. She realized this was not a normal traffic stop anymore. The officers thought she might be dangerous. Maybe someone had called in a report about her car. Maybe they thought she was someone else. She did not know what had caused this situation, but she knew it was serious. "Officer, can you tell me what this is about?" Sarah asked. "I want to cooperate fully, but I'd like to understand what's happening." The older officer's hand was now resting directly on his gun. "Ma'am, we received a report about suspicious activity. We need you to exit the vehicle now. Please do exactly what we tell you to do." Sarah did not know what suspicious activity they were talking about. She had just been grocery shopping, but she could see that both officers were very tense. The situation was escalating quickly, and she needed to follow their instructions to keep everyone safe. She slowly reached for her seatbelt and unbuckled it. Every movement she made was deliberate and slow. She did not want to do anything that might be seen as threatening. The officers watched her carefully as she opened her car door as Sarah started to get out of her car. The younger officer suddenly shouted, "Stop! Keep your hands up!" Sarah froze. She was half out of her car with one foot on the ground. She raised her hands above her head and stayed perfectly still. She could see that both officers had now drawn their guns. The weapons were pointed directly at her. The quiet Sunday afternoon had suddenly become very dangerous. Sarah found herself staring down the barrels of two police guns, and she had no idea why. Cars were driving past on the street. Some people had stopped to watch what was happening. A few had taken out their phones to record. Sarah's military training told her to stay calm and assess the situation. She was dealing with two officers who believed they were facing a real threat. They were scared, which made them dangerous. Any wrong move could result in tragedy. She needed to de-escalate this situation quickly and safely. The older officer was breathing hard. "Ma'am, I need you to put your hands behind your head and walk backward toward my voice. Do not make any sudden movements." Sarah knew that her next few actions could determine whether she lived or died. She also knew that her years of military service had prepared her for exactly this kind of high-stress situation. She just had to stay calm and help these officers understand that she was not a threat to anyone. Sarah stood perfectly still with her hands raised above her head. Two guns were pointed at her, and she could see the officers' fingers on the triggers. Most people would have been terrified. Most people would have started shaking or crying or begging. But Sarah was not most people. Her heart was beating at a normal rate. Her breathing was steady and controlled. Her mind was clear and focused. This was because Sarah had been in much more dangerous situations than this one. She had been shot at by enemy soldiers in Afghanistan. She had walked through minefields. She had faced down armed terrorists who wanted to kill her and her fellow soldiers. During her time as a Green Beret, Sarah had learned that panic was the enemy. Panic made people do stupid things. Panic got people killed. So, the army had trained her to stay calm no matter what was happening around her. They had put her through hundreds of high-stress exercises until staying calm became automatic. "Ma'am," I said, "walk backward toward my voice," the older officer repeated. His voice was louder now, and Sarah could hear the stress in it. Sarah began to move very slowly. She took one small step backward, then another. She kept her hands high above her head where both officers could see them clearly. As she moved, she was studying the situation like she had been trained to do in combat. The older officer was standing about 10 feet behind her car. He was holding his gun with both hands, and his stance was solid. Sarah could tell he had military training too. The way he held his weapon and positioned his body showed that he knew what he was doing. This was good because it meant he was less likely to shoot by accident. The younger officer was different. He was standing near the front of her car, and his gun was shaking slightly. Sarah could see sweat on his forehead even though it was not a hot day. This officer was scared, and scared people with guns were dangerous. Sarah knew she had to be extra careful around him. As Sarah continued walking backward, she was also listening to everything around her. She could hear cars driving past on the street. She could hear people talking as they stopped to watch. Someone was recording with their phone, and Sarah could hear the person whispering to someone else about what was happening. "Stop right there," the older officer said when Sarah had taken about 6 steps. "Now I need you to get down on your knees." Sarah stopped moving. Getting down on her knees would put her in a very vulnerable position. If someone wanted to hurt her, it would be much easier when she was on the ground. But she also understood that the officers needed to feel safe. They thought she was dangerous, and putting her on the ground would make them feel more in control. "Officer, I want to cooperate with you completely," Sarah said. Her voice was calm and steady. "Before I get down, can you tell me what this is about? I think there might be some kind of misunderstanding here." The younger officer stepped closer. "Ma'am, we don't have time for questions. Get down on your knees now." Sarah could see that the young officer was getting more agitated. His fear was making him more aggressive, which was making the situation more dangerous. She needed to help both officers calm down, but especially the younger one. "I understand, officer," Sarah said. "I'm going to do exactly what you're asking me to do. I'm going to move very slowly so everyone stays safe." Sarah began to lower herself to her knees. She moved like she was made of glass, slow and careful. As she knelt down, she kept her hands raised above her head. The concrete was hard against her knees, but she did not show any discomfort on her face. While she was kneeling there, Sarah's mind was working like a computer. She was analyzing every detail of the situation. She noticed that the older officer kept looking at her military duffel bag in the back seat. That bag was definitely part of the problem. They thought it contained weapons or explosives or something. Dangerous. Sarah also noticed that a small crowd was gathering. About 10 people were now watching from a safe distance. Some were recording with their phones. Others were just standing there looking shocked. A few people looked angry about what they were seeing. Sarah hoped none of the bystanders would try to interfere. That would only make things worse. "Ma'am, I need you to put your hands behind your back," the older officer said. He was walking closer to her now, and Sarah could see handcuffs in his free hand. This was a critical moment. Once they put handcuffs on her, Sarah would have no control over the situation at all. She would be completely helpless. Her military training told her that this was when she needed to start communicating more effectively. "Officer, before you handcuff me, I need to tell you something important," Sarah said. She kept her voice calm but made sure it was loud enough for both officers to hear clearly. "I think you might have mistaken me for someone else." The younger officer pointed his gun more directly at her. "Stop talking and put your hands behind your back." But the older officer held up his hand to signal his partner to wait. Something in Sarah's voice had caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she spoke with authority even while kneeling on the ground with guns pointed at her. Maybe it was the way she seemed completely unafraid. Whatever it was, he was listening. "What do you mean?" The older officer asked. Sarah knew this might be her only chance to start fixing this situation. She had to choose her words very carefully. "Officer, I'm a military veteran. I served overseas in combat zones. I think my military gear in the car might have caused some confusion." The older officer's expression changed slightly. He was still pointing his gun at her, but Sarah could see that he was thinking about what she had just said. Military veterans were not usually the kind of people who caused trouble for police officers. "What branch?" the older officer asked. "Army," Sarah replied. "Special Forces." "I did 2 tours in Afghanistan." The younger officer looked confused. He clearly did not understand why his partner was having a conversation with someone they were arresting. "Come on, let's just cuff her and sort this out later," he said, but the older officer was studying Sarah more carefully now. He was looking at the way she knelt perfectly still despite having guns pointed at her. He was noticing how she spoke with calm confidence even in a terrifying situation. He was seeing things that suggested she was telling the truth about her. Military service. Sarah could see that the older officer was starting to have doubts about whether she was really a threat. This was her opportunity to help him understand the situation better, but she had to be very careful. One wrong word could still get her shot. Officer, I have my military ID in my wallet, Sarah said. I also have my concealed carry permit. Everything is legal and documented. I think someone might have reported my military bag as suspicious, but I can explain everything. The older officer looked at his partner, then back at Sarah. She could see him trying to decide what to do next. The situation was at a turning point. It could still go very badly, or it could start to get better. Sarah knew that the next few minutes would determine which way things went. Traffic was still moving past them on the street. People were still watching and recording. The younger officer was still pointing his gun at her with shaking hands. But Sarah remained perfectly calm, kneeling on the concrete with her hands raised, waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah remained on her knees with her hands raised above her head. The concrete was cold and hard, but she did not move or complain. She could see that the older officer was thinking about what she had told him. His gun was still pointed at her, but his finger had moved away from the trigger. This was a small but important sign. The younger officer was getting impatient. He kept looking back and forth between Sarah and his partner. "Sergeant, what are we doing here?" he asked. "Let's just arrest her and figure it out at the station." The older officer, who was apparently a sergeant, did not answer right away. He was studying Sarah's face and body language. After 20 years of police work, he had learned to read people. Something about this woman did not fit with the description they had received over the radio. The call had come in about a suspicious person with military gear who might be planning something dangerous. The caller had said they saw someone loading weapons into a car near the grocery store. But looking at Sarah now, the sergeant was starting to have serious doubts. "Man, you said you have identification," the sergeant said. "Where is it?" "It's in my wallet in my back pocket," Sarah replied. Her voice was still calm and steady. "I can reach for it very slowly if you want me to, or you can take it yourself. Whatever makes you feel safer." The sergeant made a decision. "I'm going to approach you and get your wallet. Do not move at all. Keep your hands exactly where they are." Sarah nodded once to show she understood. The sergeant began walking toward her while keeping his gun ready. The younger officer moved to get a better angle in case something went wrong. Sarah could see both officers clearly, and she made sure both officers could see her hands at all times. When the sergeant reached her, he carefully reached around and pulled her wallet from her back pocket. Sarah did not move a muscle during this process. The sergeant stepped back a few feet and opened the wallet while still keeping his weapon pointed in her direction. Inside the wallet, the sergeant found Sarah's driver's license, her credit cards, and several other items. But what caught his attention immediately was a military identification card. It was clearly official and current. The photo matched the woman kneeling in front of him. The card showed that Sarah Martinez held the rank of staff sergeant and had served with the 5th Special Forces Group. The sergeant looked at the ID card more carefully. It showed that Sarah had received several commendations and medals. There was also a concealed carry permit that was valid and up to date. Everything appeared to be legitimate. "Rodriguez, come look at this," the sergeant called to his partner. The younger officer, whose name was apparently Rodriguez, moved closer while keeping his gun trained on Sarah. The sergeant showed him the military ID and concealed carry permit. Rodriguez looked confused. "So what does this mean?" Rodriguez asked. "Are we still arresting her?" The sergeant was quiet for a moment. He was thinking about the call they had received. Someone had reported a suspicious person with military gear. But maybe that person had just seen Sarah loading her gym bag into her car and misunderstood what they were seeing. Sarah knew this was a critical moment. The officers were starting to realize that she might not be the threat they thought she was. But they were still scared and confused. She needed to help them understand the situation without seeming like she was trying to take control. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She spoke in a voice that was quiet but clear. It was the voice of someone who had commanded soldiers in combat. It was the voice of someone who had earned respect through years of service and sacrifice. "Officers," Sarah said softly, "I need you to know that I'm former Special Forces. Green Beret, 82nd Airborne Division. I understand your protocols and I'm fully cooperating." The words seemed to hang in the air. Both officers heard them clearly, but it took a moment for the full meaning to sink in. Green Beret was not just any military position. It was one of the most elite units in the United States Army. These were the soldiers who went on the most dangerous missions. They were trained to levels that most people could not imagine. Rodriguez's grip on his gun tightened. He was not sure if this information made Sarah more dangerous or less dangerous. "Is that supposed to mean something?" he asked nervously, but the sergeant understood immediately. He had served in the army himself before becoming a police officer. He knew what it meant to be a Green Beret. These were not people who became criminals or terrorists. These were people who had dedicated their lives to protecting America and American values. Sarah continued speaking in the same quiet, controlled voice. "I have my military ID in my wallet, as you can see. I also have documentation of my service record and my honorable discharge. I want to help resolve this situation safely for everyone involved." The sergeant looked at the military ID again, then looked at Sarah. Everything was starting to make sense now. The way she had stayed calm when they drew their guns. The way she followed instructions precisely without panic or fear. The way she spoke with quiet authority, even while kneeling on the ground. This was exactly how a highly trained soldier would behave in a stressful situation. "What unit did you serve with?" the sergeant asked. "5th Special Forces Group, Fort Campbell," Sarah replied. 2 deployments to Afghanistan, 2018 to 2021. I was part of the training mission for Afghan National Army Special Operations Forces. The sergeant nodded slowly. He knew about that mission. It had been dangerous and important work. The soldiers who served in Afghanistan during those years had faced constant danger and had performed their duties with honor. Rodriguez was still confused. "Sergeant, what are we doing here? Should we call this in?" The sergeant looked at his young partner. Rodriguez was new to the force and did not have military experience. He did not understand what they were dealing with here. The sergeant realized he needed to take control of the situation and start fixing the misunderstanding that had led to this confrontation. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you some questions to verify what you're telling us," the sergeant said. "What?" "Was your military occupational specialty?" Sarah knew he was testing her knowledge to make sure she was really who she said she was. 18 Alpha, Special Forces Officer, she replied without hesitation. "I also cross-trained as an 18 Eco Communications Sergeant," the sergeant nodded. Those were real military job codes, and Sarah had answered immediately without having to think about it. A fake person would not have known those details or would have hesitated before answering. "Who was your commanding officer?" the sergeant asked. "Colonel James Mitchell commanded the 5th Group during my 2nd deployment," Sarah said. Before that, it was Colonel Sarah Chun. Again, Sarah answered immediately and confidently. The sergeant was becoming more and more convinced that she was telling the truth. But he needed to be absolutely certain before he put his weapon away. "Ma'am, what's in the bag that caused this situation?" The sergeant asked. Sarah was careful with her answer. "It's my gym bag, officer. It contains workout clothes, some protein powder, a water bottle, and a few personal items from my military service. There are no weapons in the bag. I keep my legal concealed carry weapon in a locked box in my trunk as required by law." The sergeant made his decision. This woman was not a terrorist or a criminal. She was a decorated military veteran who had served her country with honor. She had been going about her normal daily business when someone had misunderstood what they saw and called the police, but he still had to handle the situation carefully. His partner was young and nervous, and there were civilians watching and recording everything. He needed to de-escalate the situation step by step to make sure no one got hurt and no mistakes were made. The sergeant looked at Sarah kneeling on the concrete with her hands still raised above her head. He had made his decision, but he needed to handle the next few minutes very carefully. There were people watching and recording. His partner was still nervous and confused. And most importantly, he needed to make sure this situation ended safely for everyone. "Rodriguez, lower your weapon," the sergeant said quietly. The younger officer looked shocked. What? Sergeant, are you sure about this? Lower your weapon, Officer Rodriguez, the sergeant repeated, this time with more authority in his voice. Keep it ready, but point it at the ground. Rodriguez hesitated for a moment, then slowly lowered his gun so it was pointing down instead of at Sarah. He was still confused about what was happening, but he trusted his sergeant's judgment. The sergeant had been his training officer and had never led him wrong before. The sergeant then did something that surprised everyone who was watching. He slowly lowered his own weapon until it was pointing at the ground, too. He did not put it away completely, but he was no longer aiming it at Sarah. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stay exactly where you are for a few more minutes while we sort this out, the sergeant said. But I want you to know that I believe you're telling us the truth about your military service. Sarah felt a wave of relief, but she did not let it show on her face. She had learned in the army that situations could change quickly, and she was not completely safe yet. But this was a big step in the right direction. Thank you, officer, Sarah said. I appreciate your professionalism. What can I do to help resolve this situation? The sergeant was impressed by Sarah's response. Even after being held at gunpoint for several minutes, she was focused on helping solve the problem rather than complaining or making demands. This was exactly the kind of attitude he would expect from a Special Forces soldier. I'd like to verify your identity and take a look at that bag that caused all this trouble, the sergeant said. Are you comfortable with that? Absolutely, Sarah replied. Whatever you need to do to clear this up. The sergeant looked around at the crowd of people who were watching. Some were recording with their phones. Others were just standing there, looking concerned or curious. He realized that this situation had attracted too much attention, and he needed to handle it professionally to avoid problems later. Rodriguez, can you ask those people to move back and give us some space? The sergeant asked. The younger officer was glad to have something specific to do. He walked over to the crowd and politely asked them to step back and allow the officers to do their work. Most people cooperated, though some continued recording from a greater distance. While Rodriguez was dealing with the crowd, the sergeant approached Sarah again. Ma'am, I'm going to help you stand up now. Move very slowly and keep your hands visible. Sarah nodded and began to rise from her knees. The sergeant stayed close to help her if she needed it, but Sarah stood up smoothly and steadily. Years of physical training had kept her in excellent shape, and kneeling on concrete for a few minutes had not bothered her much. Once Sarah was standing, the sergeant handed her wallet back to her. I'd like to take a look at your military records, if you have them with you. Sarah opened her wallet and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a copy of her DD 214, which was the official record of her military service. Every veteran carried this document because it proved their service and benefits. Eligibility. The sergeant unfolded the paper and read it carefully. It confirmed everything Sarah had told them. She had served with distinction for 6 years. She had received several medals and commendations. Her discharge was listed as honorable. There was no indication of any disciplinary problems or issues. This all looks legitimate, the sergeant said. He handed the document back to Sarah. Now, about that bag in your car. Sarah walked with the sergeant to her car. Rodriguez rejoined them, and all 3 people looked through the rear window at the military duffel bag sitting in the back seat. Would you mind opening it so we can see what's inside? The sergeant asked. Of course, Sarah said. She opened the rear door of her car and pulled the duffel bag out. She set it on the ground and unzipped it slowly so both officers could see everything she was doing. Inside the bag were exactly the things Sarah had said would be there. Workout clothes, a towel, a water bottle, some protein powder, and a few personal items. There was also a small American flag that had been folded in the traditional military style. Sarah picked up the flag and held it carefully. This flew over our base in Afghanistan, Sarah explained. I was given it when I completed my 2nd tour. It's one of my most valuable possessions. The sergeant looked at the flag and felt a familiar feeling in his chest. He had served in Iraq 10 years earlier, and he had a similar flag at home. He understood exactly what that piece of cloth meant to Sarah, and to every veteran who had served overseas. Rodriguez was looking at the other items in the bag. Everything was normal and innocent. There were no weapons, no explosives, no anything that could be considered dangerous. Just the ordinary things that someone might take to a gym. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology," the sergeant said. "We received a call about someone with military gear acting suspiciously near the grocery store. Someone apparently saw you loading this bag into your car and misunderstood what they were seeing," Sarah nodded. "I can understand how that might have looked suspicious to someone who didn't know what they were seeing. Military gear can make people nervous these days." The sergeant was impressed again by Sarah's response. She was not angry or upset about being held at gunpoint based on a misunderstanding. She was showing understanding and empathy for the person who had made the call and for the officers who had responded to it. Rodriguez was starting to understand what had happened. "So this whole thing was just a big mistake?" he asked. "That's right," the sergeant said. "Miss Martinez here was just doing her grocery shopping and carrying her gym bag like she probably does every week. Someone saw the military bag and got worried." The sergeant turned back to Sarah. "Ma'am, I want to thank you for your service to our country, and I want to apologize for the way this situation developed. You handled it with a lot more grace than most people would have." Sarah smiled for the first time since the traffic stop had begun. "Thank you, officer. I understand that you were just doing your job. You had to respond to the call and take it seriously until you could figure out what was really happening." Rodriguez was looking at Sarah with new respect. He had never met a Green Beret before, and he was starting to understand that these were very special people. "Ma'am, what was it like serving overseas?" he asked. Sarah thought for a moment before answering. "It was difficult, but it was also an honor. We were there to help train local forces so they could protect their own people. It was dangerous work, but it was important work." The sergeant nodded. He understood exactly what Sarah meant. Military service was never easy, especially in combat zones. But it was something that people did because they believed it was important and necessary. "Well, Ms. Martinez, I think we've taken up enough of your Sunday afternoon," the sergeant sighed. "You're free to go?" "Again, I apologize for the misunderstanding." Sarah began packing her things back into the duffel bag. As she did, she noticed that both officers were watching her with interest and respect. The situation had completely changed from the beginning of the traffic stop. Instead of being seen as a threat, she was now being treated as a fellow person who had served their community and country. Sarah was putting her duffel bag back into her car when the sergeant approached her again. She could see that he wanted to say something more, but he seemed to be thinking about how to begin. "Miss Martinez," the sergeant said, "I served in Iraq, myself, 2nd Infantry Division, back in 2014. I know what it's like to come home and try to fit back into civilian life." Sarah looked at the sergeant with new understanding. That explained why he had recognized something in her behavior during the traffic stop. It explained why he had known the right questions to ask to verify her military service. And it explained why he had been willing to de-escalate the situation once he understood who she really was. "Thank you for your service," Sarah said. "Iraq was tough. I know some guys who served there during that time period. It was dangerous work," the sergeant nodded. "It was, and when I came home, I found that most people didn't really understand what we had been through over there. They meant well, but they just couldn't relate to the experiences we had." Sarah knew exactly what he meant. Coming home from combat zones was often harder than people expected. The civilian world seemed strange and sometimes trivial after months of life-and-death situations. Simple things like grocery shopping or going to movies felt weird when you had been in places where people were trying to kill you. Just a few weeks earlier, Rodriguez was listening to this conversation with fascination. He had never heard two veterans talk about their experiences before. "What was the hardest part about coming home?" he asked. The sergeant and Sarah looked at each other, and Sarah could see that they were both thinking about the same kinds of things. "The quiet," Sarah said after a moment. "In Afghanistan there was always noise. Helicopters, vehicles, radios, people talking. When I came home, my apartment felt too quiet. I couldn't sleep for months because it was too peaceful. The sergeant smiled and nodded. For me, it was crowds. In Iraq, being in a crowd meant danger. It meant potential threats everywhere. When I came home, going to the grocery store or the mall made me nervous for a long time. Rodriguez was beginning to understand that military service changed people in ways that were not always obvious. These two people seemed normal and well-adjusted, but they carried experiences that most civilians would never have. "How did you deal with it?" Rodriguez asked. "Time," the sergeant said. "And talking to other veterans who understood what I was going through. The VA has counseling programs that really help, and staying busy with work and other activities." Sarah nodded in agreement. "The most important thing is not to isolate yourself. It's tempting to stay home and avoid people because civilian life feels strange at first, but you have to force yourself to get involved in your community and build a new life." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another police car. The sergeant's supervisor had apparently decided to check on the situation after hearing about it on the radio. A lieutenant got out of the car and walked over to the group. "Everything under control here, Sergeant?" the lieutenant asked. "Yes, sir," the sergeant replied. "We had a misunderstanding based on a suspicious person call, but everything is resolved now. Miss Martinez here is a military veteran who was just doing her grocery shopping." The lieutenant looked at Sarah and then at the scene around them. He could see the crowd of people who had been watching. He could see the phones that had been recording. He knew that this situation could have gone very badly if it had not been handled properly. "Miss Martinez, I want to apologize on behalf of the entire department for any inconvenience this may have caused you," the lieutenant said. "Sometimes these calls don't turn out to be what they initially appear to be," Sarah smiled. "No apology necessary, Lieutenant. Your officers handled the situation professionally once they understood what was really happening. I'm grateful for their service to the community." The lieutenant looked pleased with Sarah's response. Police departments always worried about complaints and bad publicity when situations like this occurred. But Sarah was being gracious and understanding, which reflected well on everyone involved. Rodriguez had been listening to all of this, and he was learning valuable lessons about police work. "Sergeant," he said, "how could we have handled this situation better from the beginning?" The sergeant thought about the question carefully. "We responded appropriately to the call we received," he said. "Someone reported suspicious activity, and we had to take that seriously. But maybe we could have asked more questions before assuming Ms. Martinez was a threat." Sarah shook her head. "You did exactly what you should have done," she said. "You had a report of suspicious activity and you responded with appropriate caution. The problem was with the initial report, not with your response to it." The lieutenant was impressed with Sarah's attitude. "Miss Martinez, have you ever considered a career in law enforcement? We're always looking for people with your kind of background and temperament." Sarah laughed. "Thank you for the offer, but I'm happy with my current job in software engineering. Although I have to say, after today I have even more respect for what police officers have to deal with every day." The sergeant looked at his watch and realized that they had been at this traffic stop for almost an hour. "Miss Martinez, we should probably let you get on with your Sunday afternoon. But before you go, I want to give you my card. If you ever want to talk about military stuff or if you're having any problems adjusting to civilian life, please don't hesitate to call me." Sarah took the sergeant's business card and put it in her wallet. "Thank you. That means a lot. And if you ever want to talk about your Iraq experiences, I'm a good listener." Rodriguez was feeling embarrassed about how nervous and aggressive he had been at the beginning of the traffic stop. "Miss Martinez, I want to apologize for pointing my gun at you for so long. I was scared and confused, and I didn't handle it very well." Sarah looked at the young officer with understanding. "Officer Rodriguez, you were responding to what you thought was a dangerous situation. Your job is to protect people, and sometimes that means being ready for the worst-case scenario. You followed your training and listened to your sergeant when he told you to stand down. That's exactly what you should have done." Rodriguez felt better after hearing Sarah's words. He was learning that police work was more complicated than he had expected when he graduated from the academy. 6 months earlier, the lieutenant decided it was time to wrap up the situation. "Well, folks, I think we've spent enough time on this. Call, Ms. Martinez. Thank you for your patience and understanding. Sergeant, good work de-escalating the situation. Rodriguez, make sure you write a complete report about what happened here." As the lieutenant walked back to his car, the sergeant and Rodriguez began walking toward their patrol car. Sarah was putting the last of her things back into her Honda Civic. "Ms. Martinez," the sergeant called out, "drive safely, and thank you again for your service." Sarah waved as she got into her car. "Thank you both for yours." As Sarah drove away, she thought about what had just happened. An hour ago, she had been held at gunpoint by police officers who thought she might be a terrorist. Now she was driving home after having a meaningful conversation about military service and civilian life with those same officers. The whole experience had reminded her of something important. Most people, including police officers, were just trying to do their jobs and keep their communities safe. Misunderstandings happened, but they could usually be resolved when people treated each other with respect and tried to understand each other's perspectives. Sarah also thought about Officer Rodriguez and how he had learned from the experience. Police work was difficult and dangerous, and young officers like Rodriguez needed guidance from experienced veterans like the sergeant. The partnership between the two officers had worked well, with the older man's experience balancing the younger man's enthusiasm. When Sarah got home, she put away her groceries and sat down at her computer to finish the work project she had been thinking about earlier. But first, she sent an email to her old army buddy who lived across the country. She told him about what had happened and how it had ended with a good conversation about military service. Her friend wrote back an hour later. He said he was glad everything had worked out well and that he was proud of how she had handled the situation. He also said it made him feel good to know that there were police officers like the sergeant who understood and respected military service. Sarah realized that the traffic stop had actually turned into something positive. She had made a connection with two police officers who were dedicated to serving their community. She had helped a young officer learn something important about his job. And she had been reminded that most people were good people who were just trying to do the right thing. As the sun set on her Sunday afternoon, Sarah felt grateful for her military service, for the police officers who protected her community, and for the chance to build bridges between people who served in different ways but shared the same basic values of duty, honor, and service to others.